Everybody, thank you for joining me on another live stream. My name is Eric Manning. You're watching Testify, where we talk about historical apologetics, the argument for miracles, and whatever I, feel like discussing, pretty much related to the topic of Christian apologetics. So appreciate you guys joining me. We're going to be talking today, just going to jump right into it, undesigned coincidences and how they are cooler than the critics might give them credit for. And so undesigned coincidences, if you talk about them with your friend who's into like biblical scholarship, they'll kind of immediately go, yeah, and poo-poo and say that's just apologetics. That's just the McGrews, and the McGrews are weird, and you're just a fundy, and they'll hurl all kinds of weird insults at you. And so a lot of times when you see presentations on the subject of undesigned coincidences, you just get the examples. But today we're also going to talk about examples and objections. Now, if you have some questions, go ahead and save them towards the end. If you could do super chats, that would be appreciated. That supports me and the channel. But if not, just type in Q: in your question, and I'll remind you throughout the stream to do that. And so without further ado, the text that I chose was Luke 1:3-4. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of things that you have been taught. And so I'm sure that you guys will see as we go along why I chose that as a text. And so let's see here. So goals, what are we going to talk about? We're going to explore how undesigned coincidences provide strong internal evidence supporting the authenticity of the Gospels. We're going to construct a compelling case illustrating that the gospel authors were both well-informed and consistently honest. We're going to highlight that most efforts to discredit the argument based on undesigned coincidences ultimately fall short. And we're going to be talking about the common ones. We're going to be talking about some more complicated ones. I'm sure there'll be more objections to undesigned coincidences coming down the pike. I hope so. We definitely... us who advocate this particular argument, I think, I can't speak for all of us, but I could say that I could speak for myself, and I could say that we definitely welcome disagreement, and we definitely welcome criticism. I'd like to see better criticism of this argument. And so 2 questions. Why are there 4 Gospels? And can we tell, just by comparing 2 passages of Scripture with one another, that both are authentic, credible historical records? And so the first natural reply to that would be, well, sure, yeah, we can find passages where 2 different authors tell the same story, maybe even in the same words. Okay, but come on, bro, like seriously? A normal skeptical response would be, one of the documents might have been copied from the other one. How can this possibly be ruled out on the basis of internal evidence alone? Okay, so enter undesigned coincidences. An example, one book might mention casually in passing a detail that answers some question raised by the other, but such interlocking would be highly improbable if one of them were purely copied from the other, or both were purely copied from a common source, or the later book simply added a bunch of embellishments to the former. And so undesigned coincidences illustrated, let's talk about like a real life example, how this might work in the real world. Okay. There is a bank robbery, and 2 witnesses see part of what happened. One witness says that the bank robber's shoes were untied. Okay. And another witness says that they saw the bank robber trip. Well, these 2 witness statements in this robbery case appear to fit together quite naturally. One mentions the untied shoe, the other mentions the tripping, but neither mentions both. The connection seems genuine and not premeditated, even if the witnesses were not crime scene separated. Let's say that they had the opportunity to talk, maybe they were even close by with each other and they had the opportunity to talk. They don't necessarily have to be crime scene separated in order for their witness testimony to be valuable. And some of you might have an idea where I'm going with this. So the importance of apparent casualness. Casualness suggests witnesses did not collude or fabricate their stories. It indicates that they aren't trying to create a specific impression or coordinate their statements. An unlikely alternative explanation would be Sure, it's possible that one witness overheard the other and they crafted a subtle, coordinated story. However, this scenario is less probable due to the natural and uncontrived connection between their two testimonies. And so, what this casual interlocking shows is that fictions and forgeries, they don't interlock like this, right? Either they don't interlock at all, or the interlockings are more obvious because they are intended to be noticed. And so, that hideous strength and the return of the king, you're not going to find undesigned coincidences between the two, right? Um, but we would expect to find such undesigned coincidences in authentic records of the same real event told by different people who knew what they were talking about. So let's give an example from the New Testament, because this is one of those arguments that I think is like way better seen through examples than just explained, right? And so the pair of disciples in Matthew 10:1 through 4, Jesus calls his 12 disciples. He gives them authority over demons, and he says that they can heal sickness and disease. He sends them out. Okay. And it's interesting the way that Matthew records this because he pairs them together. Okay. And so it says here are the names of the 12: Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Okay, so that's weird. It kind of raises a question. Why does Matthew pair them this way? You know, a typical response might be, well, maybe Matthew thought 12 is an even number, and pairing them up like this would just make it easy for people to remember. But I think we have a better explanation than this, one that's more simple and more elegant. Mark 6:7, Jesus calls the 12. Mark is retelling the same story. And he began to send them out 2 by 2. And he gave them authority over impure spirits. So, okay. So let's rewind this a little bit. Matthew groups the disciples into pairs. Mark explains the pairing by revealing that Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. Mark provides a list of disciples, but he doesn't group them. That's kind of interesting. And Matthew mentions sending disciples, but not the 2 by 2 detail. He never mentions the 2 by 2 detail. So this highlights how one account incidentally answers a natural question posed by another, supporting the credibility of both accounts. All right, so pause, hold it. Someone immediately is going to say, oh, come on, Eric. You got to be kidding, you silly, fundy apologist, you pathetic McGrew. Don't you know about the synoptic problem? The Gospels, they're dependent on one another, okay? Mark, he came first. Matthew and Luke helped themselves. There's word for word copying, okay? What is going on? Doesn't that just undermine your entire argument? Don't be ridiculous. Matthew could have just added that detail because he just wanted to tell a story, okay? So let's talk about the synoptic problem a little bit here. For those of you who don't know what the synoptic problem is, I'm just going to give a nutshell version of it. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, share significant similarities and overlap in their narratives. This resemblance has sparked extensive scholarly debate regarding their chronological order and their connections. The prevailing theory suggests that Mark came first, and Matthew and Luke utilized Mark as a primary source. Additionally, scholars propose the existence of a conjecture document known as Q, despite a lack of patristic and manuscript evidence. And there is a lot of debate about that. There are biblical scholars like Mark Goodacre who are very skeptical of the existence of Q and have written a whole book against the idea of Q. Common stories and sayings in Matthew and Luke, absent in Mark, are often termed Q material. The two-source hypothesis posits that Matthew and Luke drew from Mark, Q, and they had some of their own unique material in crafting their gospels. There are other similar alternative theories, but that's the basic idea. Okay, so that's basically the synoptic problem in a nutshell. But there's some serious scholarly baggage that gets attached to this, and here's why I don't think that it undermines undesigned coincidences, okay? Because this is the very first thing that you will hear anytime you discuss undesigned coincidences is, but my synoptic problem, that's just supposed to end it. You hear scholars say this on podcasts and different things like that. People who should just know better, who just apparently haven't looked into anything that like the McGrews have said or others have said about this particular argument. They just instantly dismiss it with this. And so there's a lot of scholarly baggage here. The use of the two-source hypothesis sometimes includes unwarranted assumptions beyond its core premise. These assumptions suggest that if Matthew or Luke's wording resembles Mark's, they merely copied Mark word for word without additional knowledge of the events, okay? And if they do add something, it's just embellishment or their own theological or literary purposes. Critics claim that if Matthew or Luke introduced changes or new material into a shared story, it implies they fabricated details without credible evidence. So this is just black and white thinking, okay? Such assumptions are questionable and lack strong deductive support from the notion that Matthew used Mark as a source. This version of the two-source hypothesis essentially erases Matthew and Luke as independent sources, portraying them as willing to alter or invent facts, often without justification. While similar wording may definitely indicate borrowing, and nobody is disputing that, okay, it doesn't imply a lack of additional factual information possessed by Matthew and Luke when they vary, okay? Pay attention to this. This is really important, okay? This is the crux of the whole thing. Dependence is not a binary concept, okay? Let's picture this. Let's picture this scenario for a second. Matthew, I know this is a crazy idea. Maybe he was a disciple and likely had his own insights and memories, making it unreasonable to assume that he had no knowledge beyond Mark or another source. Luke also had his own notes and sources and could have included details that he wanted to add. And so Matthew, not wanting to reinvent the wheel, could have used Mark's gospel as an outline. He wasn't always there. He wasn't called until later on in Jesus's ministry, and so he may have taken Mark and used it as an outline, added his own material, and where he copied him, he copied him. Where he adds a detail, it doesn't mean, oh, you know what? I think this would be cool. Let me add this. Maybe it's because, like, hey, I don't know. He was there. He decided to add some details. Or Luke, he probably had notes. He probably had other information. So if he sees something that Mark left out, he could just simply add it. It doesn't mean embellishment. He could just add factual information. This rigid interpretation of the two-source hypothesis exceeds available evidence and should be rejected despite its popularity among scholars. Similar wording doesn't necessarily negate the possibility of independent factual accounts unless one assumes absolute independence where sources have no knowledge of each other's content. So in short, wrapping this whole section up, this whole synoptic problem objection, okay? Matthew and Luke are partially dependent while also incorporating their unique information, even when narrating similar events. This isn't merely a theoretical proposition. I'm going to show with a few examples here that this is actually what the evidence shows, okay? And so the synoptic problem is just, you're missing the point. The whole point of undesigned coincidences is to identify independence within the accounts, even where they overlap, okay? So again, I've heard biblical scholars make this mistake. I've seen people who are normally informed critics of Christianity make this mistake. Just slow down. Try and understand before you launch off into criticizing. Get this crucial distinction first. So let's show an example of this, okay? Herod and his servants, all right? Matthew 14, 1-2. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. I think you hear my kids screaming in the background. I'm sorry in advance. Maybe you don't. Anyway, so Mark's version, interestingly, has the same kind of story, but Herod is not saying anything to his servants, but he does say the same things. And so Matthew has this additional change. Now, someone might say, well, maybe Matthew's just embellishing that to make a more interesting story. Maybe he's just filling in a natural question that he thought was there, like who's he talking to? So I'll just throw in his servants. But, the idea that Matthew, how would he know what Herod said to his servants? I mean, he's not there. He's not a witness. And so maybe he just added that. And so Herod's question explained, if you look over at Luke, we get the answer of where Matthew probably got his information. And so it says that Joanna, the wife of Huza, Herod's household manager. It's like, okay. And so I'm yelling at my wife to tell the kids to keep it down out there. Sorry for the distraction there. So you see here that this fills in a question that's answered in a natural way. Luke is not writing this, okay, to explain. He's not like reading Matthew and going, that's weird, I got to explain this, okay? Luke's mention of Joanna in 813 wasn't aimed at explaining Matthew's account. Luke included Joanna in his narrative because likely he knew about her and the other women who followed Jesus. Luke is the sole gospel writer to mention Joanna and does so again in Luke 24:10. He also mentions unique details about Herod's interest in Jesus. And so while it's possible that he received some of his information from Joanna, he doesn't explicitly state it. And so Jesus has a female follower who is married to somebody in the courts of Herod. That explains it. And so I think this kind of takes away some of that synoptic problem objections here, because this is so naturally explained in such a really elegant kind of undesigned way. And so let's see here. Now you might say, well, okay, maybe they got lucky. One undesigned coincidence might be an accident, sure, like having two unrelated pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fitting together just by chance. But if we discover numerous undesigned coincidences crisscrossing the documents, and in particular, if each gospel has some things that explain things in others, it becomes ridiculous to insist that they're all just accidental, okay? So this is a cumulative case. And this is another thing that I think a lot of skeptics, they just don't understand. Like, they think, well, I can debunk, a couple of these undesigned coincidences, and, well, they must all be this bad, so I'm just going to call it good. No, that's not how this works with a cumulative case, okay? So let's run through some examples. So woe, what is that woe all about? Matthew 11:21, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. And so Jesus is angry here. He's taking the gloves off against these particular cities who rejected him as the Messiah. And he's just really, has some harsh words. But what mighty works is he even referring to? Nothing in Matthew has given us any clue to this point. So we're going to put a pin in this particular undesigned coincidence. And we're going to come back to it later, because we're going to see a group of undesigned coincidences in one particular pericope that I think is really interesting here. And so now, let's say you're inventing a miracle story. You're supposed to create a made-up miracle about Jesus and make it real. To begin, the plan is to kick off the story by having Jesus ask a question to one of his disciples. Who do you pick? Okay. If you're creating a gospel story about food and money, who do you select? Maybe Peter. Peter's always talking, right? Maybe you pick Matthew. He's a tax collector. He might know a thing or two about money. Maybe you pick Judas, right? Judas had the money bag, right? And so those are some natural people that would come to mind. Well, instead, we get this bit about Philip. It says in John 6:5, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? So what's the deal with Philip? Why Philip? Like, Philip is barely even mentioned in any of the Gospels. He's mentioned in John, and he speaks like 2 or 3 times. That's it, okay? I heard, and so Luke and John accidentally, or incidentally, I should say, fill in the details, lame pun intended. If we go over to Luke 9:10 through 11, we read that the feeding of the 5,000 actually took place near Bethsaida, okay? That the crowds followed Jesus. It was Bethsaida. So that's when Luke starts narrating the story about the feeding of the 5,000. That's where we learn the location. Now in John 12:21, we hear about some Greeks who come to Jesus, or who come to Philip, who is from Bethsaida, and they want to see Jesus. They want to talk to Jesus. And so John just incidentally, very casually mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. And so it's like, oh, okay. A lot of things interlock here. We get the fact that Philip is from Bethsaida. So that is why Jesus turns to Philip and says, hey, Philip, you're a local guy from around here, right? Where do we get bread? Where do we get bread to feed this many people? Now, of course, the question is just kind of, rhetorical, and Jesus has something up his sleeve. But if Bethsaida influenced John's account, he would have been more likely to mention the town directly than to create a question to Philip. Mentioning a question to Philip without referencing the town would be an extremely indirect way to convey Philip's connection to Bethsaida. This improbability increases if John invented Philip's link to Bethsaida in other parts of his gospel. And so John isn't like, let me fill in this little detail that Philip was from Bethsaida in my gospel later on. This is all really, 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 really indirect. And so going back to those woes, remember the woes and how harsh he was on Bethsaida? Matthew, who organizes his stories by theme instead of chronological order, presents the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 14. It's only when we compare Luke's account that we realize that the feeding happened before Jesus pronounced woes over Bethsaida. Okay. And so now all of this comes together. Now all of this makes sense. Why Jesus was so harsh, why he asked Philip, all of this stuff. And they just fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, this is one that I haven't heard a lot of people use in discussing undesigned coincidences. But Jesus appears to really have meant those woes, because now if you turn over to Mark, chapter 8, 22 through 26, it talks about a story about a blind man. You may remember the story where Jesus takes a blind man out of the town of Bethsaida, takes him out of the village, and he heals him. And he lays hands on him, or does he spit in his eyes? I can't remember exactly. No, he laid hands on him. No, he spit on his eyes, laid hands on him, excuse me. He says, do you see anything? He says, I see people. They look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. He opened his eyes. His sight was restored. He saw everything clearly. And then Jesus said, don't even go back to the village. So this was after the feeding of the 5,000, likely after the woes. Mark doesn't mention any of the woes, the harsh words for Bethsaida. Okay. But now here's a blind man in the story who's from Bethsaida, gets healed. Jesus doesn't even heal him in Bethsaida. He refuses to do another miracle in Bethsaida after that, and tells him not even to return back there. Okay. So, but wait, there's more. You have Mark 6:31 and 39. And he said to them, come away for yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure to eat. Okay, so this is again describing a scene in the feeding of the 5,000. And then in verse 39, he commands the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. Okay, so we got crowds, we got green grass, but Mark doesn't, kind of explain why there's the crowds or why there's the green grass. And so about that green grass, okay, this is what the grass looks like in the area of Palestine for a huge chunk of the year. Okay, not exactly green, not exactly lush. Okay, and so what is the deal with this detail about the green grass? This must have happened at a very specific time. Well, here is a graph from Peter J. Williams in his book, Can We Trust the Gospels? And he notes the precipitation in millimeters in Palestine. And there are two different times where this growing season would happen here based on the rainfall, right? Now, if we turn over to John 6:4 and John 6:9, we read that it was Passover. The feast of the Jews was at hand. There's a boy here who had, and then one of the disciples, I believe it was Andrew, if I remember correctly, said, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are that? Are they for so many? Okay. And so interestingly, John mentions that it was Passover, which would explain the crowds. And he mentions that there were barley loaves. Okay. So Passover is in the middle of the short growing season in Palestine. It's also a great feast in which thousands of Jews flocked to every year. Josephus says that millions would flock. Maybe he's exaggerating a little bit. But Passover immediately follows the barley harvest. Okay. So this wasn't just any rainy season. It was also the time of the barley harvest. I've seen some skeptics say, well, no, it's a much bigger window than what you guys are giving credit for. The grass could have been green many times, right? But Passover immediately follows the barley harvest. So John gives us in passing two small details that interlock in two ways with Mark's account of the same event. All right. So this is in stark contrast with the account of the feeding of the 4,000, where the narratives in Matthew and Mark just refer to the ground, never to the grass or any of these other details. So Peter J. Williams has an interesting note on these particular undesigned coincidences around the feeding of the 5,000. He says, note, however, that none of our undesigned coincidences touches directly on a miracle. One might therefore be inclined to claim that the setting was realistic, but not the miracle. The miracle, someone might argue, arose as the story was told from one person to another and exaggerated. But the problem with treating the central part of the story, the miracle, as careless exaggeration is that the undesigned coincidences suggest careful transmission of the peripheral details. If the transmission elements of a story had been careless, we would not expect the minor elements to be well transmitted. Get that point, okay? Therefore, the idea that the miracle arose through careless exaggeration involves an unrealistic process of selective corruption of the information in the story. It lacks explanatory power for the current shape of the text. And so get what Peter is saying here, because I've seen skeptics try and brush this one off. Most notably, my buddy Apologia has basically said, like, well, yeah, it could just be a historical kernel, right? But this feeding of the 5,000 story just grew and arose and, just got more and more developed over time. But maybe there really was a Philip who really was from Bethsaida, and maybe Jesus really did ask him a question, and maybe Jesus really did pronounce those particular woes and all that other stuff here, okay? But what you're saying here is that the disciples were like really, really, like the Christians, the early Christians, were really, really strong in oral tradition, and let's make sure that we pass like these details along. But then when it comes to the other oral tradition about the miracles, suddenly it's like, yeah, man, let's just keep throwing on more layers onto this thing until it finally gets to the evangelists who write this story down. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent, okay? And so let's look at a few more examples here. This one is, now someone might say, well, okay, but John probably had access to Mark, right? And maybe John borrowed Mark. Well, here's why maybe he did have access to Mark. He probably did, okay? He might have had access to all of the Gospels. But I don't think that he's word for word copying here, or trying to take a story and just embellish stuff and take what their details are and just subtly interweave his own about, Passover and the crowds and everything else like that. And here's one reason why. Here's another undesigned coincidence. This is John 12:1-2 and 12-13. There were 6 days before Passover. Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus has raised from the dead. They gave him a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one who was reclining with him at the table. And then in verse 12, the next day, the large crowd had come to the feast, and they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, crying out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And so John provides us a very unique and specific detail. Jesus came to Bethany 6 days before Passover and rode into Jerusalem on a donkey the next day, 5 days before Passover. Can we verify John's accuracy? Well, I think we can. In Mark 11:11, it says that he entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, it was already late, and he went to Bethany with the 12. So in the early portion of Mark 11, Jesus sends his disciples to fetch a colt. He enters Jerusalem with a similar welcome, but he doesn't specify the time frame, okay? But it can be inferred from Mark's account that Jesus entered Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, since the disciples fetched the colt, had the triumphal entry, visited the temple, presumably taking up an entire day. So we'll look at this further here. This is day 4 and 3. Mark's narrative synchronizes with John's when counting the days. Jesus curses the fig tree. That happens 4 days before Passover. Mark 11:12-19, it says, on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So the disciples see the fig tree is withered. The next morning, Jesus cleanses the temple and gives the Olivet discourse. Now we're looking at 3 days before Passover. And here's the scriptural confirmation of that, just to make sure that you guys know what I'm saying is accurate here. It says they passed by in the morning. they saw the fig tree withered. Okay, so this is what would have had to transpire on day 4 and 3. Okay, John and Mark agree, and it ain't because of copying, because when we get to Mark 14:1, it says, now there are 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. This confirms John's timeline by stating that it was 2 days before Passover. John and Mark's very specific undesigned synchronizations supports the accuracy of John's account, but looking at it, John isn't like digging in and like, let me count down these days and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like he's not doing that. Okay, that would be very, very indirect. Wouldn't necessarily be what you would expect. Moreover, even just going back with the feeding of the 5,000, I don't think you would get the differences in John's gospel and Mark's gospel. There's some famous alleged contradictions there. We won't touch into those today. That if John was just trying to draw an account from Mark's gospel and just throw in a few embellished details to, serve his own purposes, then you think that he could make the accounts line up a little bit better. Okay. And so there's this undesigned coincidence that doesn't look like it's from copying. And then there's the alleged discrepancies. And so it's kind of hard to really make that argument. Okay. Here's another example. The disciples, they're fighting, they're arguing over who's the greatest. Jesus, he's not having it. He's saying, if you want to be great, be a servant. Okay. He's saying, you guys think I'm great? Well, I'm among you as the one who serves. Okay. And so, okay, serves what? Like, and we know Jesus was a servant, overall, but like, this is around, the Last Supper time. And he's saying that I'm among you as one who serves. This is the Last Supper time. What is this supposed to mean? If we're just reading Luke, the context doesn't give us a hint, right? But same event, right? It's they're having the Last Supper here. We find out why Jesus could say, I am among you, the one who serves, right? Because Jesus rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, took a towel, tied it to his waist, poured water into a basin. He began to wash his disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And so notice that John doesn't mention what triggered that vivid object lesson, but Luke tells us that they were arguing about which one among them was the greatest. And so again, these are two pieces that just dovetail one with another really, really well. Okay. How about Jesus likes nicknames? Okay. John 3:16, or excuse me, Mark 3:16 through 17 says, there are the 12 he appointed, Simon, for whom he gave the name Peter, John, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means the sons of thunder. And so, I mean, that's just, fun to say. But like, this is just like an unexplained illusion, right? If we're reading Mark's gospel just by itself, we have no idea why Jesus gave him this, nickname. Like, were they rowdy? Like, were they loud? Were they boisterous? Like, what's going on? We don't have a clue just reading Mark's account alone. Well, when we go to Luke, we find out why Jesus might have given him this nickname. And it's because in Luke 9:51 through 55, the days drew near to be taken up, and he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered the village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people didn't receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them. Okay. And so, all right, well, that explains the whole Sons of Thunder thing. All right. Like, they're wanting to call fire down from these guys and go Elijah on them. But Luke never tells us about the nicknames, right? Mark tells us about the nicknames, but he doesn't tell us why they were given the nicknames. I think it's a reasonable inference to do that. Now you might say, well, maybe Luke just read Mark's gospel and he's like, you know what, let's make up a cool story of why they're called the Sons of Thunder, even though I won't mention anything about them being called the Sons of Thunder in my gospel. But we actually see from Josephus, this is from Josephus' Antiquities, book 20, that there was a custom of the Galileans who went up to the holy cities at the feast to travel through the country of Samaria. And they were in the journey some inhabitants of the village called Genea, I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, I'm sorry, which lies on the borders of Samaria and the Great Plain, and killed many of them. And so Josephus tells us that the Samaritans had like some serious animosity towards the Galileans. They didn't like them traveling to Jerusalem to go to their different feasts and different things like that. And they would wait for them on the pass and beat them up, kill them, all kinds of different things. And so if you want to say, well, this detail is made up, well, then you also have to say that Luke also really knew his historical stuff. And he thought, we know that they really do travel along this way, and that they really do beat up on the Galileans and have killed them before and all these other things. But I think now you're just kind of multiplying things, and it becomes more and more improbable and more complicated. Okay. A few more examples here, and then we're going to get to the objections. Jesus the terrorist. Okay. Mark 14:58. Jesus is basically before the kangaroo court. They're trying to come up with reasons so that they could send him to Pilate. They're coming up with accusations, and they got a couple of guys who said, oh yeah, we heard him say that, if you destroy this temple that is made with hands, in 3 days I'll build another not made with hands. Okay. So is Jesus planning on attacking the temple? Like, what's going on here? Like, where are they getting this testimony from? And then we read later in Mark, while Jesus is being crucified, those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads, saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, come down from the cross. They're mocking him, right? But there's no prior justification for this accusation if we're just reading the Synoptic Gospels. We have no idea where they're getting this idea that Jesus would have said such a thing, okay? Well, that's obviously not the kind of temple that Jesus was referring to, but we only find out when we go and read John chapter 2, 18 through 19. He cleanses the temple, and he says, hey, what gives you the right to do this? And he said, if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. And of course, John fills us in, and Jesus is talking about the temple that is his body. And so John gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not its accusation. And the synoptics give us like a garbled accusation, but it doesn't give us the actual original statement. So neither of these looks like it was copied from one another. Again, they fit together quite well. Okay. Even more on the temple cleansing. All right. John 2:20, the Jews said, it's taken us 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days. Well, we actually know from Josephus that Herod the Great began construction of the temple in about 18 BC. That's from Antiquities, right? Book 15. Based on this date, Jesus' initial confrontation in the temple at the start of his public ministry would have had to have happened around AD 27 to 28. Well, if we turn over to Luke's gospel and we compare what we see there, Luke 3:1 says that it was in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar that John the Baptist had started his ministry, right? And we have Jesus getting baptized and all that other stuff. Augustus Caesar actually passed away in 14 AD. However, in the autumn of 12 AD, as Augustus named Tiberius as the co-emperor to ensure a smooth transfer of power. We read about this actually in Suetonius. He tells us about this. And so this places John the Baptist's public ministry at around AD 26 through 27. Shortly before the date, he indirectly reveals for Jesus' discussion with the Jews about the temple. And so we have not just the Gospels agreeing with one another and dovetailing one another in these like really casual, subtle, indirect ways, but this also is Suetonius. This is also Josephus. And so like, come on, like, what more do you want? All of this goes together, right? And so therefore, Jesus' public ministry starts at nearly the same times that John's ministry ends. All of this, like I said, it just fits together. A couple more examples. Jesus, before Pilate, a very serious charge is brought against him. It says that they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Okay, pretty serious accusation. It looks like he's trying to make him out to be some sort of political rebel, okay, is what they're trying to make him out to be. And then Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said, well, you said it. You said it with your own mouth, right? And then Pilate said to the chief priest and to the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. Like, okay, hold up. What? Like, rewind. Play that back again. Like, I find no guilt in this man? Like, what are you talking about? The sequence of this events is super confusing. The Jews make a grave accusation. Pilate questions Jesus about it directly. Jesus basically says, yeah, you said it yourself, or at least rashly refuses to deny it. And Pilate is like, meh, yeah, this guy's fine. No big deal. Like, there's no guilt in this guy. Like, what is going on, right? Well, if we're just reading Luke's gospel all by itself, you wouldn't know, right? It's just a really confusing scene. But if you go over to John 18:33 through 38, Jesus is before Pilate again. It says that Pilate entered his headquarters again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Okay, well, notice how that question isn't even in Luke's gospel. He doesn't ask him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Okay, that question isn't even in Luke's gospel. And then Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world," he goes on to say that my servants would fight. And then Pilate is like, "Oh, okay, you're a spiritual king. You're a nut. You're like, whatever. You're not a threat to Rome. You're not a threat to anything here." And so Pilate went back outside of the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him." And so in John's account, Pilate's question to Jesus seems to come just completely out of the blue, right? It's just out of nowhere. It's just like, "You're the king of the Jews." We don't hear about, the different charge that he's claiming to be a king. He just flat out asks him. So that's kind of baffling. So Luke gives us the accusation, but not the full answer. John gives us the full answer, but not the accusation. So this is actually a twofer that goes both ways. And when you put them together, you get the full picture, right? But this is, again, what eyewitness testimony would look like. This isn't what you would expect from fabrications and different things like that. But you might say, well, Eric, there was fighting, right? Like, Peter whipped out his sword and hacked that guy's ear off. Like, what's going on? He cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. We read about that in John 18:10. But John 18:36, Jesus tells Pilate, "Hey, my servants would fight if my kingdom were a kingdom of this world, but my servants don't fight." Well, doesn't cutting off someone's ear count as fighting? Like, couldn't Pilate have said, "Well, hey, yeah, about that. You hacked off a guy's ear." Okay. Well, Luke 22:51, Jesus said, "No more of this," and he touched his ear and he healed him. And so Luke actually reveals that Malchus's ear, which we don't get his name from reading Luke's gospel, was actually healed. And so Peter couldn't have been arrested for the assault, nor Jesus contradicted in his claim, because there was no remaining physical evidence of this particular struggle. Okay. So I think this is my last example. And so why was Jesus being so mean to Peter? When we look at the account in John 21, they're eating breakfast. There was the big catch of fish, if you guys remember, and they had just finished breakfast. And Jesus turns to Peter in the middle of it and he says, "Hey, Peter, do you love me more than these?" And it's just like, he's basically called out in front of his buddies. And Jesus asked them this really pointed question. "Hey, Mr. Dedicated disciple, do you really love me more than these?" And so it's like, wow, that's kind of harsh, Jesus. Like, what's going on? Why does Jesus ask Peter whether he loves him more than all the other disciples do? Like, what is the burr under his collar here? Okay. Well, I think actually we see when reading Mark that he's allowing Peter to undo the damage, even though John doesn't have this particular statement from Peter. Peter says that even though all fall away, so he gets up in the middle of the Last Supper. He's Mr. Big and Bad. He's Mr. Confident in his faith. And he's saying, even if everybody falls away from you, Jesus, I'm never going to deny you. I am with you. I am with you to the very end, And of course, we know that didn't pan out. He ended up denying him before some servant girl or servant girls 3 times. And so it's like, okay, what's going on there? And so, again, we don't get this statement in Mark's gospel or any of the synoptics of this statement from Jesus. And then we also don't get Jesus making this strong statement of, well, I'll never deny you, Jesus, in John's gospel. But the two, when you put them together, fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, so now we're getting to the fun stuff. All right, we're going to talk about some objections. And so I hope you see that from all of these different things, it's not just one example. It's that we find many, many undesigned coincidences throughout the Gospels. The Synoptics explain each other. John explains the Synoptics explain John. They crisscross over each other in all of these different ways. And again, it looks more like the ring of truth, eyewitness testimony, than it does look by a bunch of embellishing. But I'm sure there are lots of people who have their objections, okay? And I've just touched on a few undesigned coincidences, by the way. There are really many, many more, and we'll talk about some resources at the end. But let's talk about some objections, okay? Let's talk about a good one, and then we'll talk about a few bad ones, and then we'll talk about some better ones. A lack of criteria. How are you supposed to identify undesigned coincidences? Like, what is the criteria? If you don't have some kind of criteria, like, what are we even talking about here? But this complaining about a lack of criteria, I think, misses the point. Undesigned coincidences are intended to demonstrate how we can determine the authenticity of the details, even when two sources depend on each other. So they're actually themselves criteria for authenticity. Like, how can we discern whether the details from source one are original and not additions from source two, and vice versa? Identifying undesigned coincidences aids us in authenticating details in interconnected sources, highlighting a shared memory. They are the criteria, okay? The argument is simple. If the Gospels are eyewitness reports, we would anticipate numerous undesigned coincidences. But if they're not, we wouldn't. Okay, that's the hypothesis. So this whole criteria thing does miss the point. And if you're paying attention, we do identify criteria, but let's review it and spell it out a little bit more. Insignificance. It might be relatively easy for two independent sources to agree on the main elements of a particular narrative, especially if the narrative is traditional or derived from a long and widespread oral tradition. However, the insignificant details of such narratives are quickly lost, and it is very difficult to arrange them to correspond with one another, especially if circumstances surrounding the coincidence are reported differently. So one of the things that we want to look for with undesigned coincidences is, are they insignificant? Remember, Bethsaida, Philip, Jesus turning, saying, where are we to buy bread? Okay, Herod saying to his servants. These are insignificant details, okay? Opacity, right? If the detail is hidden in the narrative so that one needs to dig somewhat in order to recognize it, then this is evidence of a genuine coincidence. It would be difficult for an author to produce such a coincidence and then just hide it away. And then, 1800 years later, people are like, oh, look at this. No, that's not what we're looking for here, okay? Reviewing the criteria a bit further, there's two more. Unannounced. If a writer were clever enough to think up of an undesigned coincidence and insert such a thing into a text, it would be of no benefit to them if the coincidence is not discovered for generations or was never discovered. There would be a great temptation for the writer to draw attention to the coincidence, okay? And so oftentimes when you see gospel writers highlighting different things about how Jesus is fulfilling something, they point it out, like they draw attention to it. And I know that's not quite the same from what I'm talking about here, but usually when they want to highlight something, they do highlight something, okay? The fact that this never happens with the Gospels, that the writers of the narratives appear to be unaware of the coincidences, is actually good evidence that the coincidences are genuine. And finally, consistency. This is an obvious property. The insignificant details that make up the coincidence must be entirely consistent with one another, despite their opacity and the fact that they are clearly from what appears to be independent sources, okay? And so it's just, again, pay attention. These are the kind of things that we're looking for. I think that people should already probably understand that, but this isn't like some sort of like unfalsifiable kind of thing, okay? All right, so what is probably the most common argument that I hear besides the synoptic problem? It's scholars don't like this argument, okay? But this is just an appeal to bandwagon. This is an ad populum fallacy. Whether or not scholars accept this argument should depend on the strength of the evidence that it presents. Popularity is a rotten test of truth, okay? There was a time where Q was not a popular theory. Now it's a popular theory. Now it's maybe slightly becoming less popular, okay? Like, this isn't how this works, all right? Like, no, all right? Many prominent biblical scholars, regardless of their theological orientation, hold views that diverge from the mainstream within their discipline. As in any discipline, biblical scholars have their own biases and can also be guilty of groupthink. Okay, so I was watching a live stream one time, and I think it was my colleague here, Jonathan McClatchy, mentioned something about undesigned coincidences, and a biblical scholar, somebody who I like, but I'll keep him unnamed, was like, hey, well, that's against this consensus, and scholars think undesigned coincidences are stupid, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, hey, dude, like, friend, do you hold any views? You're a biblical scholar. Do you hold any views that are outside the mainstream? And they're like, oh yeah, I could think of probably like almost a dozen off the top of my head. And it's like, right, exactly, right? Like scholars hold to a lot of different views, some popular, some not so popular views, okay? And so not everybody is just like thinking in line, okay? Biblical scholarship, it's not science, okay? It ain't physics, all right? It's not biology. And even in biology and physics, you still have people who hold different views that are outside of the majority. And so like, come on, like why are we being having such a herd mentality? I don't like it. All right. And there's the fact that several biblical scholars actually do like the argument. Okay. I'm not going to read this whole entire list of biblical scholars, but Craig Blomberg, I'm sorry, he's a biblical scholar. Craig Keener is a biblical scholar. Daryl Bach is a biblical scholar. Peter J. Williams uses the undesigned coincidence argument, even though he didn't. These are just names of people who endorsed Lydia's book on undesigned coincidences. This isn't even listing the scholars like Stanley Porter and others who have endorsed Lydia's other books, which include undesigned coincidences. Okay. You have Dr. Paul Barnett, a biblical scholar in Australia, is very respected. I've seen him use the argument from undesigned coincidences, even though he didn't even use it by name. I have his books. He does it. He uses them. Okay. Leon Morris, same exact thing, right? He's written commentaries on the Gospel of John and different things like that. He's used undesigned coincidences. And so maybe it's not a majority view, okay, but the people who are aware of the argument and are open to it, they're not like just tossing it out the window, okay? And so let's not do this, this isn't a counting noses thing, but let's just not say that no scholars like the argument whatsoever, okay? But Lydia McGrew, she's the one who's popularizing this argument, and she's a fundy, and she's not even a biblical scholar. She's just like published in philosophy journals and different things like that. And come on, this is the Mean Girls objection, okay? This is basically like, you're not part of the group kind of thing. This is just ad hominem, okay? Besides her books being endorsed by many prominent biblical scholars, I already mentioned like Stanley Porter, Craig Keener, and others, Lydia has extensively published in the area of philosophy, probability, and epistemology. She's also had multiple double-blind, peer-reviewed articles accepted in biblical scholarly journals, such as Themelios and the Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism. Like, come on, guys. Shaming somebody's credentials, credential shaming, or appealing to her religious motivations says absolutely zero about the merit of her actual arguments. Zero, nothing, bupkis, nada, none, okay? Grow up. Okay, this displays clear outgroup bias. A specialist in the field of epistemology just maybe, just entertain this in your noodle for 5 seconds, might provide valuable insights into the field of biblical studies, which is plagued with epistemological problems, using arguments from silence, all kinds of other issues, fallacious reasonings that are just clear patterns. See my stream that Lydia did on my channel about some of the bad habits of biblical scholars. Somebody with that background, with that training, just might be able to offer a good outsider critique. And instead of like being, shunning that person, we should at least like entertain what they have to say for a minute and actually engage with the material and not just do this outgroup bias thing and this ad hominem thing. It's silly, okay? If I'm animated, it's because it just gets old. It gets old seeing it. And she's not going to say it. Nobody's asking me to say it. I'm just going to say it, okay? Mendel. Let's talk about Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk who made significant contributions to the field of genetics, right? You ever heard of Mendelian genetics? Guess what? He had no formal training in genetics or biology. He was a priest. He was a high school physics teacher, and he was never even a certified teacher. He actually failed his oral exam twice, but his meticulous examination and observations laid the foundation for our understanding of how traits are inherited. He went largely unnoticed during his own lifetime to later recognized as being one of the cornerstones of modern genetics, even though he didn't possess formal credentials in the field. So just stop with the credential shaming, okay? Like just grow up. Grow up. All right. This argument is old. Okay, this is another garbage objection. Okay, um, this is chronological snobbery, dismissing ideas or practices from the past solely because they're old assumes contemporary beliefs that are inherently superior. It's a flawed argumentative approach as it fails to critically evaluate the merit of historical perspectives and ignores the potential wisdom and context of their times. And so you can't just say, well, this argument's old. Okay, it's from the 1800s. And it was by some apologist named J.J. Blunt and William Paley, like those guys, big deal. Like, so what? It's old. Scholars have moved on. Well, I'm sorry. That's not attacking the argument and any of its merits. Okay. You can't just assume, well, the argument was debunked because it's old. Okay. Who were the people back then who debunked the argument, and show me what they said? Good luck. You're not going to find it. Okay. Also, skeptics, you guys love D.F. Strauss, okay? Biblical scholars love D.F. Strauss. You guys still use his arguments. I don't fault you for that. I don't say D.F. Strauss's arguments are old, therefore shut up, okay? I don't, all right? And so, like, we don't throw his arguments out because they're old. Let's talk about them on the basis of their actual merits, okay? All right. And so that soapbox out of the way. X example is weak, therefore the whole argument must be bad. I recently saw a fairly well-known atheist YouTuber criticize somebody because they used the green grass argument. And they're like, this argument is weak, and so therefore the rest of this argument must also be weak. It must be stupid because I could explain the green grass easily. Look at this. And then they give some counter explanation, which, whatever. But that misses the whole point of it being a cumulative case, okay? This is basically the fallacy of composition. This fallacy occurs when someone assumes what is true for one part of a whole must also be true for the entire whole. But you can't conclude from one example in a cumulative case that it's weak, and therefore the entire cumulative case therefore must be weak. This is a fallacious form of reasoning because the strength of a cumulative case depends on the combined weight of all the individual pieces of evidence, not just one, okay? Not just one, okay? All right, so parodies. I've seen some of these. I'm just going to use one. The person will be nameless, but this is a person I like. I would consider him, like a acquaintance of mine, kind of a friend of mine. But he gives this example. This is supposed to be a parody of undesigned coincidences. Peter says the disciples were fasting after Jesus died. None of the other gospels say this explicitly, but it casually fits in with Matthew 9:15 and Luke 5:35, which Jesus says they will fast when the bridegroom is taken. Think about it. The prophecy in these passages that the disciples will fast when Jesus is taken away is left hanging without fulfillment in the synoptic accounts, while Peter's casual aside that the disciples were fasting makes no reference to an earlier prophecy. So both the synoptic prophecy and Peter's aside fit together casually without either one showing conscious awareness of the other, which is what we would expect on later invention. Okay. And so that's not a very good parody. Okay. Matthew describes calling his disciples, and I'm going to use it. Let me give you an example of a bad undesigned coincidence, okay, that I have seen apologists use and they shouldn't use. And then I'll explain why this one is very much like it, okay? Matthew describes Jesus calling his disciples, and it seems implausible that they would instantly leave and follow him. If you remember, Jesus walks up, says, "Come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." They drop everything, they go. The mystery is resolved when another gospel writer records that Jesus suggests that they go fishing after he preaches to them in a boat, preaches to the people on the shore on a boat, and then he says, "Peter, let down your nets for a haul." Peter lets down his nets. He gets the big net-breaking, boat-sinking kind of catch there. And so the second account, Luke's account, explains why they were mending their nets, because when Matthew calls them, they were mending their nets. In Matthew's gospel, when Jesus calls them, they were mending their nets. And that's what prompted the swift decision to follow Jesus. Details missing in Matthew's account. Well, there's a big problem here. Mending their nets for fishermen is not something that's really improbable or otherwise even surprising, okay? Neither is the disciples fasting, okay? It's not surprising. It's not improbable that they would eventually fast, okay? It's just not a thing, all right? He talks about fasting in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus does talk about fasting, okay? This is just a very weak parody because of the example being used here, but it's also a lesson for Christian apologists too, to like, hey, let's not use tenuous examples like this one, okay? Let's be picky with what we use, okay? All right, a few more arguments. Non-religious scholars don't use undesigned coincidences. Okay, great. Well, that's fine. But that's here, I'll just quote an anonymous internet guy. Undesigned coincidences which affirm the authenticity of the gospel accounts prompt me to wonder if a similar method is applied in evaluating authenticity for for other ancient sources across different disciplines. If not, this is because historians in those fields reject the practice due to specific methodological concerns. And so it's like, okay, well, if non-religious scholars don't use them, like maybe there's a problem here. All right. Well, it's actually not true. Some non-religious scholars have used undesigned coincidences. Uh, Screenshot the slide if you want to. Check up on me if you want to. These are several references from historians who have used, basically, they might not have called it undesigned coincidences, but they do use the reasoning behind undesigned coincidences in verifying different casual details and putting things together when putting together historical accounts. And so it's actually just not true that non-religious scholars don't use them. Now, I'm not saying it's widespread. I'm not saying this is the criteria that they all use. Let's just examine the argument based on its own merits, but let's also not say that non-religious scholars have just never used them. That's actually not even true. Okay, well, oral tradition. Maybe oral tradition could explain away undesigned coincidences. Well, there's a problem here. That positing the hypothesis of oral tradition doesn't really help explain undesigned coincidences, since in that case, you would simply just have cases of undesigned coincidences across different oral traditions. And so it would still look like eyewitness testimony. That doesn't really help. I mean, at that point, you just have to say, well, these people said this, and then these people said that, and then the Johannine community just kind of put together this oral tradition that just happens to interlock with this other tradition that was in Mark's gospel. I just don't think that really helps you all that much. It still ends up looking like eyewitness testimony at that point. I guess at best you're just saying they just luckily interlock. Well, then now you're back to the problem of why do so many interlock, okay? Also, crucial elements of oral traditions, as we've already alluded to, are likely to be passed down accurately, but smaller, less significant details like Philip's hometown being from Bethsaida or the precise location of the feeding of the 5,000 might not be expected to be preserved with such precision, okay? So again, I don't think oral tradition really helps you that much unless you're just saying that there was this really big, widespread oral tradition that contained all of the coincidences and all of that other stuff. But again, positing this, it seems to go against other skeptical theories about the Gospels that they are exaggerated. And then, there's just all the different problems that I've mentioned so far here. Okay, related to this, there was an earlier super gospel. Maybe there was an alternative source or other sources that had all the details that are contained in the New Testament Gospels. Okay, and that's, like there's one super gospel that contains all of the little details, and that just explains what's lying behind all these undesigned coincidences. Well, this supposed super gospel is entirely unknown and unnoticed until now, despite its detailed account of Jesus's life. There's no mention of it in the early church records. There's no preservation of it, which raises some questions. The New Testament Gospels show independence in recording details, suggesting they aren't mere selections from a single source. Their occasional apparent contradictions further support their independence. Okay, you can't, if there was a super gospel, then now why do they disagree so much? And it's just really the definition of ad hoc and against Occam's razor to introduce all of a sudden an unsupported content from a hypothetical source solely to just deny undesigned coincidences stem from the authenticity of multiple accounts. And so it's just like, maybe there's a super gospel. That's ad hoc. Okay. Like it just seems desperate. All right. What about redaction? Okay. So here's an example from a blogger who's trying to refute the argument from undesigned coincidences. He says some undesigned coincidences fade when the interest of the evangelist in the way they have compiled their sources and shaped the narratives, their redactional interests are considered. I don't think I read that right. Let's try that again. Some undesigned coincidences fade when the interest of the evangelist in the way they have compiled their sources and shaped the narratives, their redactional interests are considered. Take the timing of the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark and John as an example. John tells us that this was around Passover, which seems to be subtly corroborated by Mark's note that many were coming and going. The difficulty with viewing this as an undesigned coincidence is that the crowds following Jesus is a Markan trope. So Mark has crowds following Jesus, and the Passover setting in John may simply serve to make explicit latent Passover symbolism in the early feeding accounts. McGrew and Williams note that the green grass also corroborates the Passover setting, since Passover falls in Nisan after months of rainfall. Yet this can facticity be so easily assumed from verisimilitude? Perhaps not. As biblical scholar, and even a Christian biblical scholar, Graham Twelfthtree notes, the green grass may serve as a reminder of the fertility of the desert in the Messianic age, or allude to the good shepherd leading his flock through the green pastures, a point that Mark has already made, okay? And so, well, here's a chart, what a gospel author meant, what a New Testament scholar thinks the gospel author meant. When your New Testament professor says the green grass is an allusion to the 23rd Psalm, what Mark meant is, bro, dude, the grass was green. Like, come on. These are some heavy literary theories that are just being invoked here. These coincidences, these explanations, I should say, appear to be really, really contrived, okay? Hypotheses about Mark and John inventing details for symbolism lack explanatory power. And again, John, if he's trying to talk about symbolism, oftentimes he highlights it himself. Often, positing redaction doesn't explain why they interlock. It just usually explains one half of the coincidence. Not in this particular one, but a lot of times when people say, well, redaction, that explains it all. That doesn't explain always why they interlock. It usually just explains one half of the coincidence, okay? Overemphasizing symbolic interpretations risks misreading the Gospels. But more importantly here, even if true, real events can coincide with symbolic elements. Green grass mentioned casually in Mark. Events with symbolic or theological significance can still be historical. I mean, come on, guys. Jesus' death on Passover is well supported despite its symbolism. Redaction can't explain all the undesigned coincidences away, so you can't just use redaction like for everything here as a catch-all. And finally, and most importantly, what criteria can we use to really separate redaction from non-redaction and assess its plausibility? What criteria? How are you determining when there's redaction and when there's not redaction? Explain that to me. It can't just be, well, it's later than Mark and they tell the same story as Mark, but they tell different details, therefore redaction. No, like that doesn't work. Okay, you can't just assume that. Again, that goes back to the black and white thinking that we were talking about. And so if you can't give us a falsifiable way of saying, okay, this is definitely redaction, this is not redaction, then you have an unfalsifiable hypothesis, you have no predictive power. This doesn't work, okay? It falls apart, all right? Mimesis, okay? What about, the idea that the gospel writers took tropes from other kinds of stories, maybe Greco-Roman stories, maybe the Old Testament and different things like that. So here's another example by the same critic. Some coincidences can be explained with reference to the use of literary imitation, that is, creative rewriting of some well-known text. In the case of the Gospels, the Jewish scriptures, the feeding of the 5,000, returning back to that, Williams notes that the interlocking timing of the Passover further is subtly supported by the mention of barley loaves. In this case, however, the whole scene might be viewed as a literary imitation of the scene of Elisha feeding 100 men miraculously with 20 loaves in 2 Kings 4:42-44. Here in the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, we find the exact Greek term as the one used by John to describe the barley loaves. This dependence upon the Jewish scriptures may also help to explain why John, who is already interested in the feast, sets this event at Passover, and the Elisha story is set around the Passover too. And so, like, here's kind of a bedtime story. We're going to explain this all away. Basically, he's just copying the Old Testament, and that explains why all of these interlock. That explains maybe this story at best. It doesn't explain all of the other examples that we're talking about here. Also, this can smack a little bit of parallelomania. You got all those strange Lincoln and Kennedy coincidences and that are out there. See Mr. Beat's video on that. Parallel observations between Jesus's life and the Old Testament. Again, just like we talked about with redaction, they don't necessarily automatically imply invention. Okay. Maybe Jesus was specifically imitating this story like on purpose, because that's the way he wanted to orchestrate it. Like, you don't really have a way of saying like that can't be true. You're just saying similarities, therefore copying that by itself doesn't work. Okay. As I already said, intentional orchestration of parallels by Jesus or God really isn't problematic at all for the author. And then again, this isn't sufficient to explain many of the other coincidences. And then suggesting mimesis also, often, I'll get it here in a second, also often explains only half the coincidence, not why the details interlock with another source. Okay. And so just invoking this mimesis, therefore, there can be no undesigned coincidences, because we know that the gospel authors used mimesis, therefore there can't be, they're just erased. Like, no, that doesn't work. You have to deal with each specific example and show how that works. At least this particular author like tried to do that, but that doesn't get rid of all of the other coincidences, right, at best. And again, going back to what I said, Jesus acting out something from the Old Testament deliberately, like they can't just be disproven because we have something in the Old Testament. Okay. What criteria can we use to separate parallels from non-parallels and assess plausibility? Again, we're running into a criteriological problem. How exactly are you going to prove that? What's mimesis? What's not mimesis? When can you actually show that? You can't just say, well, this looks like a parallel to me, therefore, boom, mimesis, it's proven. Like, no, that doesn't really work. And if you know how a lot of these scholars who are talking about mimesis try to go about proving mimesis, they'll take dissimilarities and say, well, that's mimesis, like he's doing it on purpose. He's trying to pair opposites. Like, at this point, it's just the wild, wild west, and it becomes a huge game of confirmation bias. Okay. Like with redaction, mimesis has no predictive power. I'm sorry, I don't think this is a very good explanation of undesigned coincidences at all. And so finally, we're at the end here. Well, I can use X and Y and Z to explain away everything you said, okay? And so if you're going to say, well, it's literary dependence for X, okay? Even though it's subtle, even though it looks undesigned, it's designed, it's literary dependence. That's going to explain some of these undesigned coincidences. And then when that doesn't work, I'm going to plug in mimesis, or I'm going to plug in redaction. And I'm going to explain away these couple of undesigned coincidences. And then for another undesigned coincidence, I'm just going to say like oral tradition, and I guess they just happen to interlock. Okay, like, and as a catch-all for everything else, you're just going to say, well, that's just coincidence, and whatever, who cares? Now this is really complex. This is becoming more and more ad hoc. You have one hypothesis, the reportage hypothesis, the hypothesis that I'm suggesting here, that explains all the data in one fell swoop, okay? And so you don't go about multiplying hypotheses and get the best, most simple explanation. That's not how that works. I don't think you'd want your doctor to do that. If you have 5 symptoms of one disease and they're going to explain all 5 symptoms as 5 different diseases because they can explain it that way, and they don't want to diagnose you with the bad disease because they don't want to give you the bad news, you probably should go find a better doctor, okay? And so what this invokes here is what I like to call the very clever burglar's hypothesis. I got this from Lydia McGrew, of course, where basically, say you're with a friend, you're staying at his house, and he believes in the very clever burglars, okay? He believes that these burglars, they follow him everywhere he goes, and they leave no trace behind them. And so the burglars got in last night, according to your friend. But the doors are still deadbolted. Everything is still locked. Well, okay, according to your friend, they carefully shut the deadbolts behind them and leave no trace, okay? And you're like, okay, but I see no footprints. And he's like, well, no, they walked in through an uncarpeted area. Or they walk in barefoot. I don't know. And then, well, the alarm never went off. Okay, well, yeah, well, they know how to power down everything and get through, to where there would have been no electricity last night in your house, and they got through when that happened because they used an EMP or something. I don't know. And you could go on and on and on and on and on. So basically, he has this theory that can be constructed in a way that just can never be disproven. Well, if you have an unproven theory, a theory that can't be unproven, I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, just can't be disproved, that's an unreliable theory. Okay. You can't just reject contrary evidence claiming that your theory is just so flexible that it can account for any absence of a break-in. Okay. And so this is the very definition of ad hocness. All right. All right. And so we have reached the end. Like I said earlier, if you have questions, I'm sorry I didn't prep you guys for more of this. Type Q : and your question, and I will try and answer them. But if you want more, JJ Blunt's book, Undesigned Coincidences, you can download it for free in the Google Play Store. It is out of print, basically, and so you can get a copy for free. Or I'm trying to think of the word, and all of a sudden I'm going blank there. But basically, it's public domain. That's the word that I'm looking for. You can get that. Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View. Also, Testimonies to the Truth has a question on undesigned coincidence, or a question. It has a chapter on undesigned coincidences. And so you can definitely check that out. And so both of those books will be really, really helpful. Obviously, Hidden in Plain View is about nothing but undesigned coincidences, and it has the most examples. And so that would be the one, if you're interested in this argument, that I would recommend. And then also, like I said, the chapter that she has on undesigned coincidences definitely deals with the Synoptic Problem objection. And I think that is worth the question alone, or the cost of the book alone. And so, so those are two resources. And so let's get to some questions real quick here. Thank you guys for bearing with me here on some of my getting tongue-tied and whatnot there. Favorite undesigned coincidence in the Old Testament. I have a video, Lego David, if you go back and look, there is an undesigned coincidence in the accounts of Sennacherib coming to basically destroy the temple, that whole story with King Hezekiah. If you go back and find that video, there's some interesting ones regarding that whole account of what's going on with the prophet Hezekiah and all of that. And so I would definitely check that video out. Let's see if we have any more. Spartan theology, cheater, bad guy for not doing the Q : but I do see your question. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, Ethan, I appreciate you watching, man. Would I be open to having a conversation with you? Sure. Yeah, I could do that. Just get a hold of me. My contact information is just where you would find it in the About page. There's an email there, and you can definitely get a hold of me. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you. Let's see. Do we got any more? I don't think we do. Here we go. All right. Cephas has a newbie question. He says, there are a few verses in the New Testament that have been added in some manuscripts, Mark 16, John 8, 1 John 5. How could we know nothing else could have been added before our earliest manuscripts? Well, I mean, basically, yeah, that if you just look at all of the other manuscripts that we have and the earliest manuscripts and the best manuscripts that we have, that's the way that we were able to determine that. And so it's not in the older manuscripts, and it's not in the other manuscripts. We're looking at like a number of different things, and that's how we can determine. And so, yeah, we're looking at volume, we're looking at earliest. If they're not there, then that's the way we kind of put an asterisk around that particular passage and go, something might not be right. Like in John's pericope about the adulterous woman, it's even found in a Lucan manuscript. And so, that's why there's questions on those kind of things. And so hopefully that helps you a little bit there. There's a book called Myths and Mistakes. No, that's not the one that I'm thinking of there. I'm sorry. There's books by Daniel Wallace on the whole manuscript thing. I'm trying to remember the exact name of the book, and I'm just drawing a blank at the moment. But he gets into all of why we could find that. I'll try and put it in the description later on that you can reference there. So I appreciate the question there. Let's see if there's any more. If not, I'll let you guys go here. Flame, have you seen any scholars address this argument in published scholarly format, or do they just dismiss it? I will say this, Dr. Jeff Tripp is going to be going on the Myth Vision podcast, and he's I would say, a pretty reasonable biblical scholar, and I'm very interested in his critique. He's going to be critiquing this argument. And so I don't know when that's going to be, but I imagine that it's supposed to be pretty close. And so I would be very interested to see what comes out of that particular podcast episode. I have some decent hopes for that one. I'm glad he's interacting with it. Most scholars that I've seen just like absolutely dismiss it. That's just apologetics. That's just McGrew doesn't understand the synoptic problem. Oh, that's just old. It's just very, very dismissive overall. Some of it I don't think it's like just mean-spirited totally. I think it's just kind of like, it's just not really on my radar. There's just kind of an apathy about it. Some of it feels like they're just like, there's like this territorialness almost, like, nah, how could they possibly have anything to say about that? They're not a biblical scholar, like I've already mentioned. And so, no, I haven't, but I do have some decent hopes for this stream with Jeff Tripp. And I'm looking forward to that. I'm really glad that he's doing it because, again, I want to have the best critiques against this argument. And his stream where he was responding to Bauckham, even though I disagreed with him on a lot of points, it was pretty decent. And he's more of a middle of the road, I would say, kind of scholar compared to some of the other scholars you see on Myth Vision. And so thoughts on, Jeff says he had a super chat question. Let me see if I can have that. Find that here, Jeff. Appreciate that. Let me see if I can sort that out. I don't know why it's not letting me sort. Normally it does. Jeff, thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate that. Are there any non-red letter word-for-word phrases shared between the Gospels? Obviously, longer strings of shared words would be less coincidental than, say, 2 or 3 words. Any non-red letter word-for-word phrases shared between the 2 Gospels? I mean, I'm sure that there are. I guess you would just have to do a side-by-side comparison. I'm sorry if this is maybe somewhat of a disappointing answer to your question, but I mean, if you just compare Luke and Matthew to Mark, it seems like it's basically a lot of the stories are word for word. I mean, I'm thinking of like, I've just been going through Mark again recently, and like the story about the man let down by 4, there are some changes for sure, but the phrases are there. I don't really know. I don't have like a really good answer to your question. I'm sure they're pretty close to word for word in some areas, but then there's also variation in other areas. And so, again, it goes back to sometimes a variation is just a variation, just because there are 2 different authors that are saying things word for word. It could be copying because they just thought there's nothing wrong with me using this particular document. It seems like a pretty good document, but when they change something, it might not necessarily be, well, this is an embellishment. This is like other factual information that I have that I want to add. It could even be, and this is an out there thought, that they just disagree and that they want to maybe correct something that the other author said. I'm not saying necessarily that's true or false. I'm just saying that's a possibility. We do see variation in eyewitness testimony all the time. And that's one reason why I don't think variations really undermine biblical reliability very much. It just depends on the kind of variations that we have. Are the kind of variations that we would expect in eyewitness testimony? And that's not a problem. Are they like just direct conflicts that are completely like unresolvable, that are just telling you 2 different things, like where say resurrection appearances were? One says like Jerusalem, the other one says Galilee. You might say, well, Eric, we actually do have that. But that's something that can actually be easily harmonized, that I discussed in other videos. They're not the same appearances, but if that's what we had, and it just by all looks of things like cannot be readily harmonized in an unforced kind of way, then yeah, I would think we would have to just say, well, that's just a flat out contradiction, and it would bear on their reliability, if that makes sense. And so Ray Giordano, thank you for the super chat. If the New Testament writers were liars, they broke the cardinal rules of being a good liar. Avoid details, especially specific details. And I mean, that's what you see in the apocryphal Gospels, don't you? You don't really have the interlockings that we're talking about in the apocryphal Gospels. If they were, the fact that they're a good kind of a test case against the Gospels, in the sense that we don't have these kind of things. They don't interlock with one another in this kind of a way. they do tend to avoid details and just focus strictly on dialogue and dialogue only. A lot of times, although not always, for sure. I mean, there's ones where they are trying to tell you accounts of like what Jesus did and turning clay pots into birds or something, and, you know, cursing a little kid like a Harry Potter having a bad day or something in the infancy gospel of Thomas. But a lot of these, they do avoid those kind of things. And when they do get into details, they're not highlighting specifics in terms of like geography, or names of people, customs, and if they are, they're often not getting them right. And so, like, not, you know, the few ones that they do have, or they're just easy to get facts. And so, yeah, I think that's a good point there. Let's see if there's anything else here. Are there undesigned coincidences in Mark, Luke, and John that interlock with there being guards in Matthew? I don't think that there are off the top of my head. Perhaps. I don't know. I don't think that there is. Thank you for the super chat, by the way, Grays. I think I see that there. Yeah, I don't think that there is one. So I know that's an interesting thing that people bring up, like, hey, you know, Matthew obviously made up this story of the guard of the tomb because he's the only one that talks about it. I think, again, there's interesting answers to something like that. I have articles that I can send you if you're interested. Just shoot me an email or something like that on the particular guard of the tomb, or maybe we could talk about that in another stream. But no, there's no undesigned coincidences between there that I'm aware of off the top of my head. Thoughts on Markan priority versus Matthean priority? According to the early church father Papias, Matthew may have originally been written first in Hebrew. I think that it's possible that there was a Matthean document that was kind of like Q, that was like more of a sayings gospel. And then later on, people came along and wrote, they took Mark's gospel, they took this particular sayings gospel of Matthew that was written in Hebrew and translated it into Greek. Is that somewhat speculative? Sure. But it does fit better with the patristic evidence. There are some scholars that have suggested this. I'm not just like, you know, pulling this out of thin air. And so that's one way. I know my friend David Paulman would say no Matthean priority all the way. See his series of videos on Faith Because of Reason if you're interested in that. I'm not 100% sure if I agree with him on those things. I just haven't looked into this particular topic in great detail, because the thing about undesigned coincidences and just different evidences that we have for the reliability of the Gospels is a more interesting question to me than like who wrote first and how they use their sources and different things like that. And so, yeah, I think the hypothesis that I'm proposing here is okay, but I just don't think that it fits better with the patristic evidence, like I said, than the whole idea of Q. And so, but I'm not going to like die on that particular hill. So, all right. Well, I think that might be all that we have for today. I really appreciate you guys tuning in, watching, and hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this answers some of your questions on this particular argument and addresses some of like the objections. Because again, I see a lot of people, they discuss this argument, but they don't really talk too much about the objections. And so I wanted to get into some of that. I would like to see just better criticism, like I said, of this argument overall. I am hopeful for this particular stream with Jeff Tripp. We'll see how that goes. And so I'm sure this will be a topic that continues to come up, and I'm sure it'll continue to be kind of an unpopular subject with some people, and some apologists are still going to love it and still use it. And so anyway, if you liked this video, do all the YouTube things. If you want to support me, just go to patreon.com. It's JesusAlive.com. And you can do that there, or you can become a channel member. You can find information about that later on in the description. And so thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next.